The plan for Cisco's new R&D center is to bring as many as 1,700 jobs to the Ottawa area and potentially more in other parts of the province as well. But is the $220 million price tag for taxpayers worth it? Joining us now to debate that, Jim Stanford. He's an economist with the new trade union called Unifor, and Daniel Trefler, professor of business economics at the U of T's Rotman School of Management. And it's good to have both of you here. And it's just not the same saying you're not the economist for the CAW anymore.
Give it some time, Steve. That Unifor logo and that nice red U we've got, that's going to become an omnipresent symbol.
I think the guys taking your pictures and making sure you sound good are members of your union.
And
so
if your mic goes off in the middle of the debate, Daniel, it's got nothing to do with union affiliations.
Let's just...
Rotman hacking into the
I want to... Okay, gentlemen, back on track here. Let's control room if we can't bring these graphics up here, because I know everybody's semi-familiar with the numbers, but let's just reiterate here. Here's what we know about the Cisco deal. It's a 10-year deal. If it goes according to Hoyle, 1,700 jobs potentially created at the end of it, $220 million worth of government subsidy. And I guess what I want from both of you first is just some first impressions as to your, whether you thought this was an advisable thing for the Ontario government to do.
Not advisable. It's costly. Maybe we can talk about some of the numbers later. It's targeting a company which may or may not be around for 10 more years. You never know.
Cisco?
Cisco. Companies in high tech go down fast, and we don't know what its motivation exactly is for why it's doing this. We don't know exactly what the details are for whether this, what are the consequences if Cisco doesn't live up to this deal. So there's a lot of, it's costly, there's a lot of uncertainty about what it's going to deliver, and what are the benefits. There might be some, we can talk about the details, but there will be maybe some small benefits, but I don't think they're going to be $220 million worth of benefits.
Okay, hold that thought there. We're just going for first impressions here. Jim, first impressions.
Well, we don't know the details, obviously, Steve. We don't know the fine print in terms of the conditions that are attached to the money, the commitments that Cisco is making. So I do want to learn more about those. If the details are strong, then I think this general sort of approach does make a lot of sense. 1,700 well-paying high-tech jobs, you're actually going to earn back the $220 million just on income taxes from those people, the supply chain that feeds into the operation, let alone tax revenues on the company itself, probably within 3 to 4 years of operation. So it will be a net fiscal winner for the province. More importantly, this approach of being active in trying to land what you can call a keystone investment. Cisco is a globally important firm. This is an innovative, modern activity that's taking place. It's a tradable activity. In other words, we're going to be generating export revenues through this type of work. For all of those reasons, this is exactly the sort of job we want more of in Ontario, and it helps to have government play a role to make that happen.
Well, let me follow up on that last part, because this is a profitable company.
Yes.
This is a company that has a success track record all around the world. This is a company that could do this even if it weren't getting the $220 million. So the question is, why do taxpayers need to subsidize this to the tune potentially of $220 million?
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't know if you've noticed, but the global economy doesn't work on principles of fairness these days.
I have noticed.
And corporations don't do things because they can afford to. So the reality is, unless we're going to, start going back to an era in which capital was controlled, in order to attract businesses in key industries like high tech, like the auto industry, like aerospace, like other high value services, we have to offer a proposition in Canada that's at least as appealing as what they can get elsewhere, whether the company's profitable or not. So this shouldn't be seen as a way of helping out Cisco. Cisco doesn't need our help, obviously. This is a way of helping out ourselves by making sure that companies like Cisco have a strong presence in Ontario and that we get the benefits of that activity.
Want to respond to that?
I would like to elaborate. I mean, Cisco and all corporations are much more footloose than provinces. So Cisco can shop around its company to different jurisdictions. Ontario can't shop around itself to different jurisdictions. So they've got the bargaining chips on their side of the table.
In other words, if you don't give us this money, we'll just go somewhere else and somebody else will give it to us.
Yes.
That's the nature of the game today.
Right.
Well, if that is the nature of the game, then we had to do this, right?
No, we didn't have to. We could forego it. I mean, Cisco was getting some. So we could talk about what those numbers look like, because I'm not sure that I would quite agree with Jim about whether it was so beneficial to us. So I just ran some quick figures on what that $220 million is buying us. So if you think, let's be realistic here, it's not like we're hiring high-tech people who are sitting there unemployed right now. We're hiring high-tech people who are already in pretty good jobs. So let's assume that when we hire these guys, they're going to be paid a little bit more, maybe $20,000 or $30,000 more than they're currently earning. Because they're certainly we're not creating new $100,000 jobs here. And what's that going to give us? Well, my numbers are, of that 220 million, Cisco is getting 120 million. The workers are going to get about 65 million in higher earnings, and the taxes that we're going to earn on that extra earnings, because every time we earn money we pay the government, they're going to earn about 35 million. So and that's over the 6 years. I know you were mentioning a 10-year horizon. Mm-hmm. There's two parts to the agreement. The first part is a 6-year agreement, so I'm just working off those first 6.
But all right, so you're saying that,
we're not going to be making
But that assumes there's no new jobs created, and that's where Daniel and I would disagree. I mean, even if some of the workers in the Cisco operation are recruited away from someone else, you're still creating new activity there, and you now have a vacancy somewhere else that you can fill, which means even more opportunity. Unless you actually believe that the scale of activity in Canada is held back by the limited number of workers, then they are new jobs. And if you assume that, then it will be a fiscal winner.
You're going to have to assume that there's, bearing the numbers that I've just given, 120 million of that 220 is going to Cisco. You're going to need a lot of new jobs here. You're going to need a lot of more payroll, because right now the payroll I'm getting at is about 65 million. So we're going to need a lot of new jobs.
It's probably
so. Let me state it a different way, because I know we don't want to get bogged down in numbers. I think what we could probably agree on is that it's not going to be an overwhelming win for the province. My sense is it's going to be a loss. $100 million loss is big, but I've seen the government make much worse decisions than that. Maybe it's not 100 or 120 million that I'm saying. Maybe it's less.
Well, how do you define an overwhelming win or loss? Well, if it's 1,700 new jobs created, that sounds like an overwhelming win, is it?
But it won't be 1,700 new jobs created. Where are these 1,700 people? What are these 1,700 people doing currently?
Maybe they're in university.
Yeah, they're developing. It's a 10-year thing. The one interesting aspect of this program is they've got a skills development, recruitment, training dimension to it. So they are going to build up our overall capacities. It might be coincidental, Steve, but there's actually quite a parallel between this initiative and what the government had already been doing in the auto sector. The amount of money involved is similar to what the federal and provincial governments together would have given for one of the major auto assembly plants. And the number of workers, 1,700, you'd be a bit higher for a standard 2-shift assembly plant, probably around 2,000.
Well, can I follow up with you on that?
A similar sort of cost-benefit trade-off.
Let me follow up with you on that, because I don't know about that. I mean, my hunch is people understood why the government came to the rescue of, for example, General Motors and Chrysler to save those jobs that pretty definitely would have disappeared had the government not done that. That is not the case here. This is the government coming in and writing a pretty big check for a company that truly doesn't need it, for jobs that are not disappearing. They don't technically, I guess, exist yet. So these are not analogous situations.
Although in the auto case, remember, they also gave money to companies like Toyota, Honda, Ford, which were not going bankrupt. They were facing the same kind of decision that Cisco is. I need to invest in new capacity. I'm going to create jobs. I'm going to put new models. Where shall I put them? And similarly there, and say in aerospace or some of the other internationally mobile industries, you need to be there. Not just with a checkbook, by the way. You need to have a whole range of tools in your toolkit and use them all to try and nail down Ontario's share of those high-value industries. So even though, again, the company isn't a basket case, the company isn't a charity case, think of this more as an investment on our behalf in jobs and incomes that we want down the road and that we wouldn't have otherwise.
Dan, do you remember the former NDP leader federally, David Lewis, who once called them corporate welfare bums?
I remember it well.
Is that what's happening here?
I wouldn't call them, it's corporate welfare, but they're extracting it from us. It's not like we're voluntarily giving it. But I think we should respond just a little bit, because examples can be very misleading if we don't look at the big picture. The auto subsidy, I think, was a great idea, and we should ask why it was, but let me give you examples that weren't such great ideas. So then you start to see that the anecdotes don't tell you the whole story. We had that Xstrata bought Falconbridge, that Vale bought Inco, both disappeared. U.S. Steel bought Stelco, lost tons and tons, however many thousands of jobs. There are many instances in which we go to give carte blanche to the private sector to be involved in Canada, and it proves to be a disaster. So these anecdotes are not the way to go. You got to be a little bit more systematic and evidence-based in answering questions like, will it really create 1,700 jobs? And there's been many, many studies over the years, most, not all, but most of which show that this really doesn't do much for the economy.
And that's where the devil can be in the details. Like the counterexamples that Daniel mentioned are where the government gave approval for something. In this case, it wasn't a handout, but it was approval for a foreign investment, presumably with some conditions about Canadian jobs as part of the quid pro quo. But those conditions were too weak. The government, the federal government in this case, was not determined to enforce them. And as a result, we saw a terrible decline in our production in both of those sectors. So making sure, and that's what I said at the beginning, I want to see the details of the arrangement with Cisco, making sure that the company is held to account for the commitments that it makes is a crucial part of a successful deal here.
Yeah, so let me make a generalization to that, to Jim's point, which is an excellent point. What's going to be, the reason that I'm not too hard on this agreement, the reason I'm not very negative about it is that it looks like, the little bird that I've heard says that there's a big difference between the negative examples I gave you in this deal. What's crucial is what performance requirements you're making of the firm and whether the government has to pay up front and then watch what happens or pays in response to performance. In this deal...
do we know that yet?
Yeah, I think we know. I'm not sure, but I think we know that $220 million is not coming up front. It's coming if the 1,700 jobs appear and if the $4 billion in R&D appears.
Let's do another example that I think might be more germane for this situation. When Dalton McGuinty was in power, they were negotiating with, I think, a Quebec video maker named Ubisoft. And they offered a $250 million subsidy for Ubisoft to come to Toronto to build a new factory or a new...
design center or whatever they do.
Thank you, yeah, okay. And the idea clearly was you don't get that money unless you meet various targets on job creation and contribution to the economy. It would make sense if this were the same kind of arrangement, wouldn't it?
I think it is.
So then if it is, the taxpayer is relatively well protected, right?
Yes, with one exception, which is yes. The answer is yes. I do want to bear in mind that there are downside risks. You're saying that Cisco is this, this company of which can never possibly have a downside. We know that 10 years ago, Apple was near bankruptcy. We've seen what happened to RIM BlackBerry. Cisco itself, about 5 years ago, was in the tank and had to reinvent itself. I don't want you to leave this, your listeners to leave this room thinking nothing bad could ever happen to Cisco and there's no way they're going to pull the plug. In fact, to amplify that, you might ask the question, why are they doing it here and not in New York?
Why are Cisco coming here instead of New York?
Yeah, why is it outside of the United States and not inside of the United States?
What's the answer?
I'm going to guess.
Go ahead.
My guess is that Cisco has booked large amounts of profits outside of the U.S., is waiting for an amnesty to bring those profits back to the U.S. In the meantime, they've got to do something with those funds.
So we're part of that story.
We know that U.S. companies have $1.5 trillion in untaxed profits sitting offshore, waiting for Congress to let them bring it in free.
Gotcha. Jim, let me ask you about this. You pointed out a while ago that when those efforts were made to save General Motors and Chrysler, that the government of Canada and Ontario, I think, actually did offer money to other car companies as well. So it was a sector-wide approach. In this case, it's not a sector-wide approach. They have made a deal with a company. Does that cause you any concern?
Well, in the auto case, it was sector-wide in the sense that they did similar things with other companies, but it was never sector-wide as a blanket act. They dealt with one company, they dealt with another company came along and said, hey, I've got an investment too. Okay, let's work out a deal on that one. So I don't think that the Cisco arrangement has been in any way limited. It's saying this is the only company we're ever going to do that for. If anything, I'd say this is positive. And I would say all the other companies in this sector, including our own BlackBerry, should be looking at this and saying, this has some opportunity for us. And they should approach the government with similar proposals, with a proposal to expand their R&D or expand some other kind of important high-value aspect of their operations, do it here, and expect to get similar treatment.
Do you have any concern about that approach?
Absolutely. I think we should ask the broader question, which is, how should industrial policy be done? And the way it should be done is, it seems to me, you start with strong macro framework policies, which means that you want to make sure that we're not, that the tax environment is good, that we're not running big deficits. You have to remember we're running, what is it now, $11 to $17 billion deficit, depending on the numbers. Interest rates are going to be going up next year. That's going to leave us very cash starved next year. And I know that Wynne is very much aware of that, which surprises me that she wants to give away $250 million. But so you get that right, and then you start thinking about infrastructure. You start thinking about, if this was going to be happening in Toronto, do you have a list of what you would do in Toronto for infrastructure? I think I have a list. You want to make the quality of life in the city way better, because that's how you attract firms like Cisco, through quality of life.
And that was part of their value proposition to come to Canada in the first place. Clearly,
Right.
their leadership talked about that as it being
Right.
a place that high talented people will come.
So you want to get those high talented people. You get them by offering quality of life. You get quality of life in part by infrastructure projects like improving transportation. So those are the two things. You start with infrastructure and macro policies, and it's only after that that you might want to dig a little bit deeper. But I think the last thing you want to do is appeal to one company. You want to fund industries, not companies, because if you fund a company, you're pushing a special interest agenda.
The reason I asked
Very
Jim is because, of course, again, under the McGuinty government, they made that $7 billion deal with Samsung, which seemed like a good idea at the time. Samsung's going to pay $7 million to come here and do their windmill projects here. And then it pretty quickly came to the fore that it wasn't a great deal. And in fact, the Wynne government has had to renegotiate it because it turned out not to be such a good deal. Should we be concerned that that's a potential for this case too?
Again, I think the devil is in the details. And this is where, in a way, we have to reinvent our policy framework. Daniel threw in the term industrial policy, which is actually a term you hardly ever hear anymore. It kind of went out of fashion in the late 1980s when many economists and many government officials accepted the vision that government shouldn't be involved in the economy in any direct way. We should just, get the framework right, cut taxes, deregulate, and wait for business to beat a path to our door. And that strategy has not worked out. Canada has deindustrialized badly during that period. We've lost much of our footprint in high value added industries and become much more reliant on pure resource extraction and export, which has its own problems. So the fact that we're thinking about this again is a positive step, but we have to learn how to do it. And to get the best deals from these companies who are ruthless. They're ruthless, they're mobile, they're greedy. You need to have entrepreneurial, intelligent, informed government officials who can follow the industries, who can call the companies bluff, who can find a deal that makes sense for both parties, and then enforce the deal. The capacity of government to do this sort of thing, I think, has eroded a bit, and that's why we kind of have to learn how to do this again and do it right.
Let me share with you and our viewers a brief excerpt from a Globe and Mail exchange between one of their, Tavia Grant from the Globe, and one of the Cisco officials on why they needed the provincial contribution to come here. Let's put this up if we can. Here it goes. So why do you need a provincial contribution, the Globe asked, and Robert Lloyd said, we operate in a free labor market. We just go where the talent is and have the best environment. The move by the Ontario government makes it extremely easy for our engineering team in a free market to take advantage of the talent, the predictability for us to build a workforce here in a good tax environment. Daniel, what do you take that to mean?
Nothing.
Don't hold back. Tell me what you really think.
They are shopping around. They have choices, and they want to know who can we extract the most from. And it turned out that they could extract the most from the Wynne government.
And they didn't want to say it that way, so he dressed it up in all of that kind of subterfuge of the language there. There's obviously a lot of corporate spin in that because he's anticipating the criticism. Why should a profitable global company take a government handout? If I can hearken back to your analogy to David Lewis's term about corporate welfare,
Yeah.
I actually don't think this is corporate welfare. In a way, it's corporate workfare. If we do it right, we are saying to companies, we'll give you some money or some other advantages. Again, I stress, it shouldn't just be writing checks. You should have all the other tools there in return for doing particular jobs. Corporate welfare, to me, is just giving the company a tax reduction or some other handout and not expecting anything in return.
But we do expect something in return here.
We better, otherwise there's absolutely no point to doing it. And I'm in line with Daniel if that's the case.
Daniel, let me put this to you. In this province, various governments over the years have made decisions to subsidize various industries for various reasons. We've talked about the fact that we now own a couple of car companies, or at least we own a lot of shares in a couple of car companies. The province of Ontario subsidizes electricity rates for some. We talked about the Ubisoft example, where they offered $250 million for that video game manufacturer to come set up here. If they meet certain targets, they get certain money flowing and so on. If we operate in a free market economy, why does it feel as if we need to, bad word I admit, but let's use it, bribe people to come here?
Why do we feel? I think that's very simple. I think you got to think about who's really at interest here. And the two big interest groups are the government, who's seeking re-election, and the firms. I've already talked about how the firms are footloose, and that gives them a bargain advantage. Could you imagine if if this announcement had come through, and then Wynne at the last minute said, no, we don't like it? And she would have to face all the critics saying, you would have this show today, not about why she did it, but why she didn't do it. And it's exactly that playing to the, to the electorate that forces her, especially in a minority government position, to take on these, to make these decisions, which are not well informed.
Not well informed. Well, but well politically based, I guess.
Yes, absolutely.
Because if anybody came forward today saying, if anybody ran for office today saying we are opposed to any kind of provincial subsidy for profitable business, I mean, that's a non-starter, isn't it?
Well, Mr. Hudak has said that.
Should be.
He has said that, but whether he do that is
a
another
pretty
thing.
blanket prohibition on any kind of government engagement in these decisions, and I think politically that's an enormous risk for his party to do that, because even in many of the seats that they hold, there's thousands of people who know their jobs depend on keeping those firms and those activities here in Ontario, and I think they understand the magic of the free market alone isn't going to do it.
Well, I think we need to rewind here. We have to decide whether or not these policies are effective or not. I think here, Jim and I, it's probably the only thing that Jim and I disagree about. I don't think these policies are terribly effective.
Not effective insofar as they don't
generate the jobs or the clusters that we expect.
Or the tax revenue?
Or the tax revenue, yes. So in this particular case, it's a small scale. We're going to get some of the money back for sure. It's probably, I'm guessing that it's a well-structured deal. We'd lose, even if we lose $100 million for a few votes, that's, to my mind, that's peanuts compared to, say, Rob Ford, wanting to waste $1 billion on to get some votes out of Scarborough. So I don't want to be down on this too much. But if we're going to start spending billions rather than 100 million, then I want to step back and ask, this can't possibly be worth it. And I think the examples that people have in mind are, look how well, for instance, Japan did in the 70s and 80s with industrial policy. But all of the assessments since then have gone back and looked at what the Japanese MIDI, the equivalent of Economic Development Agency for them, did. And they picked losers routinely. It was a disaster.
They're paying for it now.
And they're paying, I don't want to make quite that leap, but they were successful in the 70s and 80s, not because of industrial targeting.
And then had basically a 20-year recession, so they're bad decisions.
Now, but let's do China, because people really often hear that China is a brilliant example of industrial targeting. And it's not. You have to be really careful here about who's benefited. First of all, if you take all of those funds are going to state-owned enterprises. So if you look at something like solar panels, you see side by side firms that are state-owned enterprises producing solar panels received huge amounts of money from the government, and they're producing nothing. They're basically mothballed. And next to them will be private sector solar panel companies who receive nothing from the government and are still open and functioning. What's happened, to my mind, in China is that some interest groups, the party and a strong state-owned enterprise manufacturing base, have received billions of dollars to enrich their own coffers at the cost of Chinese society, the cost of consumers who basically earn nothing on their interest and can't afford, will never have pensions of any substantial amount, and at the cost of huge distortions of their economy.
Let me jump in because we got a minute to go here. Let me give 30 seconds to each of you. The Economic Development Minister may be listening to this conversation. Would you advise him to do more of these kinds of deals? Fewer of these kinds of deals? None of these kinds of deals? Jim.
For industries that are tradable, that is oriented around export markets, innovation intensive, and generate jobs that have higher productivity and higher incomes than average, it makes very good economic sense to do more of these deals, not less. But my advice would also be, don't just use the checkbook. Make sure you've got all the other tools: procurement policy, trade policy, infrastructure, capital investment policy. Make sure they're all aligned and doing the same thing, and you'll get some good success from that.
Dan?
The sun doesn't rise because the rooster crows, and the Canadian economy doesn't do well because Cisco arrived. It's the other way around, I believe. So the government should continue to spend its scarce resources on more macro and infrastructure policies.
And that's our debate. Good debate.
All right.
Jim Stanford from Unifor. I'll get used to it eventually.
Very good,
I know
Steve.
I will. Thanks again for coming in today, Jim. Daniel Treffler from the Rotman School of Management, also Canada Research Chair in Competitiveness and Prosperity. Dan, thanks for being here again as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.